Good afternoon. Welcome to this beautiful gray weekend we have before us, and welcome to the Humanities Forum. My name is Ian Bernhoft. I coordinate the forum. It is an initiative of the Humanities program at Providence College with the purpose of offering to the Providence College community a chance for us to come together outside of the classroom to explore new ideas, to learn from scholars, journalists, writers, experts from around the world, and to deepen our appreciation for the humanities. Today's lecture is sponsored by a generous Constitution Day grant from the Jack Miller Center, so I want to acknowledge my gratitude for that right up front. Before I introduce our speaker today, let me give you a brief rundown on what to expect. If you've been to this before, you've heard this shtick before, but I'm going to assume that you know nothing. So we'll have, our talk will be for about 45 minutes, after which there's approximately 30 minutes of Q&A. So usually we wrap things up right on 4:45 or so. After that, there's a reception down the hall in the Fiandella Great Room with tasty things to eat and drink and the chance to continue the conversation. Things you should know. First of all those beautiful screens you have out, I'm going to ask you to shut them down. Pencil, this young man in the front with pencil and paper, you got it going on. Good work. That's what we do. Why? Not because we hate technology, but because we want to give you the opportunity to be present to today's event and to each other without being distracted. Second rule, and this is ironclad. During the Q&A, a student must ask the first question. So if all you students are quiet, we're going to sit here in silence until 4:45. First question's on you. So as you're listening, think about what questions are sparking. What do you want to hear more about? What would you like to follow up on? And then the last suggestion really is to join us down the hall. There's always plenty of nice things to eat, and it's a beautiful room. And it's a way to get your weekend started right. Okay, enough of my spiel. Let me introduce our guest today. Jerome Foss is the endowed professor of Catholic thought and culture at St. Vincent College in Pennsylvania. Foss teaches in the political science department, directs the Center for Catholic Thought and Culture, edits the journal Conversatio, and he also directs and oversees the St. Vincent College Rome program, which I'd love to hear more about. Not during the talk, but Dr. Foss publishes and speaks in the areas of American politics, political thought, that's what we're hearing today, right? Catholic thought, but also literature and politics. For example, his most recent book is entitled Flannery O'Connor and the Perils of Governing by Tenderness. He's visiting us from Latrobe, Pennsylvania, where he lives with his wife and 8 children. So he knows something about having to rule over a small republic. And let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Foss. I wasn't looking at my notes far enough. Also, courtesy of the Jack Miller Center, I've got a grip of these really cool pocket constitutions. If you're a student and you make eye contact with me as I'm walking around the room and go like that, I'll give you your own pocket constitution. So you can look at it as you're listening to Dr. Foss's talk, and then go home and learn more about it there. All right, now, Dr. Foss.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Dr. Bernhoft, and thank you all for coming. It's good to see a lot of my old friends. It's good to see my former colleague, Margaret Watkins and Rob Miner. Good to see you both. Pat McFarland, Jim Keating, Raymond Hain, all friends. So really good to be here. First time at Providence and seeing your beautiful campus. Thanks to my wife. It's her first time actually hearing me give a public lecture, so hopefully I won't embarrass her too badly. So she braved some traffic to come with me today. And thanks too to the Jack Miller Center for co-sponsoring this talk. Why September 17th matters, Constitution Day. So this is your Constitution Day lecture, and am I right that you celebrated Independence Day this year, 4th of July, had some hot dogs maybe, watched some fireworks, celebrated the 4th of July. But did you celebrate Constitution Day this year? you have hot dogs, set off fireworks, do anything to mark September 17th? I guess you're celebrating it today with me. This is the celebration to come to the lecture. I wondered this for a while. Why do we celebrate Independence Day and not Constitution Day? Not that we shouldn't celebrate Independence Day, but I think we should do more to mark Constitution Day. Right, July 4th certainly matters. It's a special anniversary. The Declaration of Independence. Make sure I knew how to work this. There we go. The Declaration of Independence is, of course, very important to us Americans, and it's one of the most significant political documents in Western civilization, if not the world. Nothing in what I say tonight should lead you to think that we shouldn't be celebrating Independence Day and the 4th of July. You can keep having barbecues and watching fireworks and all that fun stuff that you do with your friends and your family. Maybe you should even do more on the 4th of July. Does anyone read the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July? I do. I don't know if anyone, a few people do. That's good. I think that's a good thing to do. It's good to think about the Declaration of Independence, to study it. It's a very well-crafted document. It's worth thinking about how it's crafted, how it's designed. It's a syllogism. It has a major premise. This is the beginning of one of its set of major premises that it makes. Most of it's a set of minor premises, the list of grievances. And it draws a conclusion that these colonies are now and ought to be free and independent states. It's worth counting the references to God in the Declaration of Independence. There's 4, and they're very purposeful. So go back and look at it. But this isn't a talk on the Declaration of Independence, it's a talk on the Constitution. And I was trying to think about what I wanted to talk to you about with the Constitution, and I want to talk to you about everything. So I'm going to cover a lot of ground tonight. I'm going to say some things that I hope are new to you, maybe some things that you have learned before, maybe some things that are provocative, and then we could talk about it afterwards with the question and answer period. One thing to note here, since I have the Declaration of Independence up, is that this opening line, this very famous language, we hold these truths to be self-evident, right? This is, I called it a major premise a moment ago. It's a general principle. It's something that the drafters of this document are claiming is true for everybody everywhere, not just for Americans. So I'll come back to that here in a little bit. The Constitution, why should we celebrate the Constitution? Why celebrate September 17th? The Declaration makes the case for independence. It makes the case for revolution. And revolutions are interesting, they're fun, they're exciting. It's easy to celebrate them, especially when the revolutions are successful, as the American Revolution was. Right? Defeating the greatest military force on earth at the time was a matter of great pride. So it's good to celebrate this thing, but the Constitution does something too. What the Constitution does, or what the Declaration did, was make the case for the revolution. But after the revolution, you have to figure out what comes next. Right? I like that song in the Hamilton musical, the King George song, the second one, where he asks, I'm not going to sing it, I don't sing, but what comes next? You've been freed. Do you know how hard it is to lead? You're on your own. Awesome. Wow. Do you have a clue what happens now? I don't really like the attitude in the song, a little sassy, but he's asking the right question, right? What do you do after a revolution? How do you govern yourself? And the truth is, the Americans didn't have much of a clue what would happen after independence was gained. There was much confusion. Prior to the war, the 13 colonies each were governed independently, and yet at the same time they were all English, and so they were kind of the same. Should the 13 newly freed states operate as cousins, or as siblings, or as one people? Were Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, Rhode Island separate nation states, or part of the same nation? Did they defeat the British as allies, or as a single people? When the Declaration spoke of the United States, Was the united an adjective or part of the proper name of the new nation? Nobody really agreed. Opinions were all over the place. And raises a sort of a philosophic question. Is nationhood a choice? Can you choose to be a nation, or is it simply a fact? And if it's a fact, how do we discern that it's real, that a nation really exists? Right? Was America really 13 nations, or was it really one nation? Well, sometimes all you could do is start moving and see what happens. Experience is often the best guide in helping us understand reality. And so the Americans took their first steps. But they tried to step with both feet at the same time, and the result was they stumbled. On one foot, the step allowed the states to govern themselves independently, while on the other foot, they tried to govern the states as one, in concert. It was a case of trying to have one's cake and eat it too. They wanted to have local liberties at the state level while enjoying an open economy and military protection at the larger national level. Holding these things together is harder than it might seem. On the state side, the new constitutions that were drafted for the states were a little confused. In some cases, the states simply kept their colonial charters. Other states wrote brand new constitutions. About half of these opened with bills of rights. They opened with a Bill of Rights, which was the normal way of proceeding. These bills of rights were basically preambles to the state constitutions. I have up here the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which opens the Virginia state constitution. It was written by George Mason. Reading these state bills of rights, like the one up here on the board, the Virginia Bill of Rights, probably will remind you of the Declaration. Right? Here, all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights. And I'll let you read the rest, but it looks a lot like the Declaration. And it was written about the same time, actually a little bit before the Declaration of Independence. Governments rest, this Bill of Rights and all the other state Bill of Rights said, on the consent of the governed. Their purpose is to protect life, liberty, and property. Often, these lists would be followed with a list of particular rights: freedom of religion, freedom of press, the right to a jury of one's peers, etc. Following the Bill of Rights, the preambles, which were the Bill of Rights, the states laid out their frames of government. In general, all of the states had strong legislative bodies, at least legislatures with lots of power. Colonial Americans had learned to trust their elected legislative leaders and distrust their governors, the governors of the colonies, because the governors were appointed by the monarch, whereas the legislators were elected by the people. But even then, most of the legislative bodies had representatives who only served for 1 year, which meant they had to act quickly to get things done. This resulted in laws that were numerous, unstable, and often unjust. And state governors could do little about it. After the Revolution, the governors were not chosen by the monarch, obviously, they were elected, but there was still distrust of executive power. And so most states had governors who served 1-year terms. The mantra, the bumper sticker everybody had on their carriages said, "Where annual elections end, tyranny begins." And so they stuck with annual elections wherever they could. But that meant that governors also were sort of hard-pressed to do much. There wasn't enough time. It wasn't a very stable office. And most of the states did not afford their governors real effective veto power to keep the legislature thinking about the common good or the bigger picture. So basically, legislatures got whatever they wanted, and they changed their mind frequently. At the national level, we had this famous document that governed the states in concert with one another. Its full title is the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. It was, as we'll see in a minute, sometimes called a firm league of friendship, a league, a union of nation states. It was a hastily written document, and institutionally speaking, it was quite weak. And it didn't take long for people to discover that it was inadequate for the purposes that it was supposed to serve. When I teach the Articles of Confederation in my classes, I always tell students that just by reading it, you can identify 3.5 problems with it. So what are the 3.5 problems? Well, even in the title, right, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, right? What is a confederation? A confederation's a league. It's the same thing as a league that I mentioned a moment ago. It's sovereign states that come together for some common interest, but they remain sovereign states. What is a perpetual union? Well, it's the coming together of things that are now one, no longer separate, but one, and they mean to be one perpetually, forever. I don't think you could be a confederation and a perpetual union at the same time. So there's the first problem is an identity problem. What are we, a confederation or a perpetual union? You could see this problem throughout the document. This is the preamble to the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. I won't read it all to you. You can look at it and see that it's not very eloquent. It's pretty straightforward and pretty clearly tells you that this is a league of sorts because the parties to this document are the states. And just to make sure you understand the picture, the states are listed one by one. In fact, they're listed twice, just to make sure you know that. Article 2, Article 1 just tells us that the name of this thing is going to be the United States of America. Article 2 says each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. In other words, it tells you right out off the bat that the states don't really want to give anything up, right? If you're entering into a perpetual union and you start with this kind of a language, it basically says if we're not happy with how things are going, we're not really going to be a part of it anymore. We're not giving up anything unless we expressly say we're giving it up. This is a very difficult way to run a perpetual union. This language seems to hint at confederation, and a very weak confederation at that. Article 3, this is where the firm league of friendship language comes from. The said states hereby severally enter into a firm league of friendship with each other, and we're going to do all of the things that friends do. We've got each other's back. If there's a problem in one state, we're all going to come together to help fix it. In other words, we want to be something like a perpetual union. Hard to do that when you've told each state that they can basically do whatever they want to do whenever they want to do it. It's going to be hard to come up with institutions to really make these things work. Right? Plus, if you have to say that we're friends, are we really friends? I'm guessing most of you have friends. You have friends? Most of you look like friendly people. I bet you have friends. When you form a friendship with somebody, do you make it explicit? Do you say, hey, you know what we are right now? We're friends, right? In fact, just to make it clear that we're friends, I have a piece of paper here for you. I would like you to read this over and sign it at the end. It's just a document, a contract of our friendship, right? Friends don't do that. If you're friends, you don't need to write it down that you're friends, right? You don't need to say that you're friends. But in this case, they needed to tell each other that they are friends. Okay, I'll come back to this one. Let me leave it here for a second. Because of the identity crisis, it was really difficult to craft good institutions. I don't have a slide about the institutions. But really, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union creates one political institution. It's called Congress. So there's a legislative branch of sorts with the Articles. But this Congress is very different from the Congress we have today. It's unicameral, meaning it's just one house, not two. The people who are in the Congress are delegates, not representatives, which means they've been appointed by their state governments, their legislatures, to go and represent the interests of the state. They've not been elected by the people to represent the people. They could be recalled by the state legislature at any time, and often it was the legislatures, not the state governor. So they could be recalled if the state doesn't like how they're representing the state. The state could send up to 7 people as delegates, but they voted as a block. They only got 1 vote per state. The states were treated equally. So a big state like the one I live in, Pennsylvania, had as much say as a small state like the one we're in right now, Rhode Island. Right? They were treated as equals, regardless of population, regardless of wealth, regardless of the role they play in the nation otherwise. And you could only be a delegate, I think it's 3 out of every 5 years or something like that. So you have to have a rotation in the office, meaning you don't really get to build up a group of people who understand how Congress functions. That's the one institution that tried to do everything. There's no executive branch. The states are left to execute the decisions that Congress makes. There's no judicial branch. State judges are relied upon if necessary. Of course, there's not going to be any necessary reason to use judges because no one's going to be executing these laws anyway. So there's an institutional weakness. So first problem, identity problem. Second problem, there's an institutional problem here, right? Institutional issue. The third problem is simply a resource issue, resource problem. Congress has no ability to raise money. They can't raise a revenue for themselves. And if you think about the American Revolution, like how do we get to the Declaration of Independence? It's because the British Parliament was taxing the colonists without their permission, right? No taxation without representation. Another famous bumper sticker. Still see that one around sometimes. Because of that distrust, and because the people weren't actually electing representatives to serve in Congress, they didn't give them the power to tax, which meant they had to ask the states for money whenever they needed money. And the states, that firm league of friendship, that right here promises that they'll do everything they're asked to do because we're friends, right? The states learn very quickly that if they don't pony up and pay the money, there's no consequences. No one's going to kick anyone out of this firm league of friendship. And when one state doesn't pay, nobody pays. And this is dangerous because what Congress is responsible for are some pretty important things like defense, sending ambassadors out to other nations, diplomats, regulating some commercial things that requires actually paying some people to perform inspections and other things like that. They're also responsible for the mail. Can't really have a post office without money. So huge problems because they don't have resources. I said there were 3.5. What's the half problem? Well, it's poorly written. So don't read this. Just know that that's one sentence. If you write one sentence like that in your papers and turn it into your professor, they're going to kick you out of the class. You might get kicked out of Providence College if you write a sentence like this. I don't know. And it's a pretty important sentence. If you do read it, you'll find out that this is the closest that the Articles of Confederation comes to creating a judicial branch, except for it's Congress. So what happens if there's a dispute between 2 states? Let's say, I don't know, Rhode Island and Connecticut have some sort of dispute over a boundary or over water rights or something like that. That's a serious thing, right? When 2 nations, sovereign nation states, can't agree on something, they have to try and solve it either diplomatically or they just fight. And we don't want the states that make up the United States fighting. And so we need to have a way of resolving differences between states. This is the way that the Articles of Confederation wants to resolve things, by confusing everybody to death. Right? They set up special courts to solve problems, basically. It's a very confusing and tough sentence to read. So when I say it's hastily written and not very well written, this is what I'm talking about. And it's not just a problem of writing, it's that this is something that might actually happen at some point. And if we don't have clear guidance on how to resolve differences between states, then bad things might happen. All right, we're going to get to the Constitution here. So far I haven't said anything about the Constitution. Hardly a decade passed before it was apparent to everybody that what was happening in the Articles of Confederation was not good. It was a failing frame of something, not even a government. Something had to be done, but what do you do? That's a serious question. What do you do when things aren't working? What do you do when you've set up a structure, even a weak institution, and it doesn't work? I don't know. Here's a few things that could have happened. When the officers of the Army were not getting paid, they could have simply grabbed their guns and marched to Congress and demand payment. That almost happened. Washington stopped them. Or if you're unhappy about things happening in your state, like a group of veteran farmers in Massachusetts were, you could pick up your guns that you still have and have a rebellion. Shays' Rebellion, that happened. And when the governor of Massachusetts said, hey, I've read the Articles of Confederation, we're a firm league of friendship, I have a rebellion happening in my state, I think there's something in there about everybody coming to my aid. Do you know how many of the 12 other states came to Massachusetts' aid during Shays' Rebellion? If you're thinking zero, you're right. Nobody. Everybody said, we're really busy today. We can't really send any troops. Sorry, Massachusetts. In other words, when things aren't going well, revolution's very tempting. Why not have a revolution? I mean, they're exciting. We know how to write really cool documents justifying them. It seemed to work in 1776. Why not have a revolution in order to fix all the problems that are happening under the Articles of Confederation? Well, to avoid revolution, you really need cooler heads. And cooler heads had to prevail to prevent another fight. This is a list of some of those cooler heads. Basically, they convinced Congress to invite the states to send delegates to Philadelphia to have a convention in order to talk about ways of fixing the Union. Here's the actual language. To render the federal Constitution adequate to the exigencies of government and the preservation of the Union. That sounds like a benign sentence, but if you read it carefully, it means we need to fix the problem in any way we can. And some people understood what it meant, like James Madison, who showed up 2 weeks early to the convention in Philadelphia with a trunk full of books that he had been reading on basically how to write a constitution, reading a lot of political history, a lot of political theory, political philosophy, anything he could to help clear his mind and prepare for what was about to happen. He realized they were going to write a new constitution. Most other people were late, but they eventually got there. Here's some of the most important people who took part in the Constitutional Convention. Some of them you've heard of, I'm sure. George Washington was there. Benjamin Franklin was there. Really important to have those people there, even though they didn't do anything while they were there, because they're famous and everybody respects them. It adds legitimacy to what is going to happen. Right? When people say, did you have permission to write a new constitution? They could say, well, George Washington was there. Benjamin Franklin was there. They all thought this was okay. Right? Do you think George Washington's a traitor? You think Benjamin Franklin's a traitor? That was their role. They could just sit there and add legitimacy to the proceedings. Edmund Randolph was a very well-known politician from Massachusetts. James Wilson was from Pennsylvania. Let's see, a few other people. You'll know Elbridge Gerry because you've heard of gerrymandering. It gets its name from him. Roger Sherman, very important person from Connecticut. Most famous person from Rhode Island, by the way, was no one. Right? The only state that didn't send a delegate to the convention was this state right here. So don't know why, but I do know why, but I won't tell you why right now. They didn't like what was going on. Alexander Hamilton was a very important person there as well. So was Robert Morris. He's not on this list. He was probably the wealthiest person in America at the time and lived in Philadelphia. One reason to hold the convention in Philadelphia was just so people like Robert Morris and Benjamin Franklin could be there. And Gouverneur Morris, who represented Pennsylvania, was there. And if you've never heard of Gouverneur Morris, go out, do yourself a favor, and learn all you can about Gouverneur Morris. Very interesting person, and as I'll say in a few minutes, he's actually the one who writes the final draft of the Constitution. They had to solve those 3.5 problems that I just mentioned, and the hardest thing to resolve was the identity crisis. Are we a group of nations or are we a single nation? Can't have it both ways. The battle lines were drawn immediately. The lines were drawn not geographically, but in terms of size. Larger states like Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts held one view, and smaller states held another view. And Congress ended up being the locus point of that dispute. The larger states favored a bicameral legislature that rested on the principle of proportional representation. More people living in your state, more representatives. Smaller states wanted to maintain the principle of state equality. And if you have state equality, there's no need for two houses. The fight over this issue lasted several weeks, and the convention almost broke up a couple of times. It was finally resolved by a committee over the 4th of July weekend, the significance of which was not lost on anybody. That committee was led by Roger Sherman, and they came up with what is called the Great Compromise, or sometimes the Connecticut Compromise, since Sherman's from Connecticut. It called for a bicameral legislature, two houses. The lower house would be based on proportional representation, thus signaling that the League of Friendship was now officially a single nation. But the upper house would be based on state equality, which seemed to indicate that the principle of state sovereignty still had some place in American life. At first glance, this looks like the schizophrenia of the Articles of Confederation was carried over to the Constitution. But looking closer at the design and the logic of the Senate helps us see that this is not the case, and that the nationalist position was favored by those at the convention. For one, the state legislatures could choose the senators, but once chosen, they could not recall them. Senators served for 6 years, staggered terms, making it a very stable institution. Most importantly, each state was afforded 2 senators, not 1. And those senators did not have to vote in common. Each had their own vote. Each was independent. Senators were thus provided with quite a bit of space from the pressures of the states so that they might think about the common good for the whole United States. Once the form of Congress was settled, the convention turned to the powers of Congress. These too caused serious debate, and it moved the main dividing line from big versus small states to northern versus southern states. The various regional economies meant that issues of commerce and taxation were vexing. Nowhere is this clearer than with the issue of slavery. Most delegates at the convention would have been happy to see movement toward the end of chattel slavery. It seemed to be ending in the north and working its way south. The ending was working its way south. And just about everybody opposed the barbarities of the slave trade, and they were ready to see it outlawed. And yet there was a small group of intransigent delegates from the South who would have been willing to walk out the door if Congress was given the power to end or even curtail slavery. To keep the Georgia and South Carolina delegates from bailing on the convention, compromises were made. These should be understood, I argue, as exceptions to the more general anti-slavery tendencies of the Constitution. This is just an overview of some of the things that are in the Constitution. I should have shown you this a moment ago. The most famous, or maybe infamous, exception to the anti-slavery tendencies of the Constitution is the 3/5 clause. This is Article 1, Section 2. This clause is often discussed, but never with much accuracy. I often ask students, and I'll ask you, I won't ask you to answer, but you could think about it. What position would you have had if you had been at the convention in 1787 when this clause was being discussed? Without knowing the context, you probably would say that slaves are people and they should be counted as people. One of the convenient things about the Articles of Confederation was that because all states were treated equal, slavery questions could simply be avoided. And so the Articles of Confederation was agnostic on the issue of slavery. But once you become a single nation and part of your nation has slavery, then you have to make some really tough decisions. The fact that proportional representation was agreed upon by the convention for at least the House of Representatives meant they had to figure out something about slavery. They had to talk about it. Because if you have proportional representation, if your representation is based on your population, then you have to count the population, which means you have to figure out how to count the population. Who exactly are you counting? Those are tougher questions than it may seem, especially when some states have huge slave populations. That's the context. So let me ask you the question again. What position would you have? If you count the slaves as part of the population, then what do? You increase the voting power in the House of Representatives for the slave interest. And so it's the northern delegates, the anti-slavery delegates, who are against counting the slaves as part of the population. The 3/5 clause, right, the agreement to count 3 out of every 5 of the slaves, is a compromise made to appease the South. Not a good compromise, but not good, I think, for the opposite reasons that we usually think. It would have been much better to not count any of the slaves. But still, the main point I want to make is that this is as a compromise, it's an exception to the overall anti-slavery tendencies of the Constitution. The other infamous compromise comes in Article 1, Section 9, which prohibits the outlawing of the slave trade for 20 years. Just about every state had prohibited the slave trade. The states that depended upon it the most were Georgia and South Carolina. And no one doubted that a unified nation would have little trouble mounting the popular support to shut it down across all the states. Why else would Georgia threaten to walk out the door unless they were given some sort of appeasement? That appeasement was a 20-year moratorium on a prohibition. But Congress was still given the power to tax imported slaves, which would hopefully discourage the practice at least a little bit. And of course, on January 1st, 1808, the slave trade was officially outlawed, the very first day that it could be outlawed. The main point's not really about slavery here, right? It's that the presence of the compromises here, the slavery compromises, the reason they're there is because we now are clear that we're dealing with a nation, one nation, and not 13 nations, which means we have to start thinking as a nation about tough issues like slavery. But I should say more, since I've made the claim that the overall tendency of the Constitution was anti-slavery. Should give you at least a taste of why I say that. I'll do so by looking at Article 1, Section 8. This is where we go to find out what powers are given to Congress. You'll see, I didn't write it word for word here, this is just a brief list, but the very first power given to Congress is the power to lay and collect taxes. That fixes one of the problems I mentioned earlier. But they're also given all of these other powers as well. Right, to establish credit, regulate commerce, to provide laws for naturalization, bankruptcies, coin money, weights and measures, punish counterfeiting. I mean, it's remarkable that about half of the powers in Article 1, Section 8 deal with matters related to the economy. And what they're really doing here is giving Congress the power to establish what we might call an open or free economy throughout the entirety of the United States. A free economy, based on these principles, and the other things point to this too, right? An open and free economy where work is rewarded and encouraged, where a way of life is promoted that is completely opposed to the principles of slavery. Right? The slave states don't honor work. Work is something that slaves do. An open and free economy does reward work. It does honor work. It teaches people that work is good. And ultimately, you can become much wealthier than a slave-owning plantation person. This is reinforced by some of these other things, especially the power to promote progress of the science and useful arts. You could get a trademark or a copyright. The United States government will protect your intellectual property. This is giving people the encouragement to innovate, to come up with new and better ways of doing things. The second half of Article 1, Section 8 deals with military matters, especially, well, the Army to be sure, but Navy too. Why do we want a Navy? Yes, to protect us, but also to protect our commerce as it travels across the ocean. Navies are really important for that. So Congress's role seems to be very much in the spirit of developing a robust economy for the United States, very different from the Congress under the Articles of Confederation. The hope was, in doing this, that the long-term tendencies of such an economy would be a vibrant, wealthy people that favored Republican principles and not the aristocratic principles that tended to support the slave economy in the South. That the framers of the Constitution were generally opposed to the practice of slavery can also be inferred from the fact that they refused to use the word in the Constitution. In both the 3/5 clause and the slave trade clause that I had on the board a moment ago, the word person is used rather than slave. The word slavery will not be used until the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery. I've digressed here a bit just because the slavery issue is so important and I think often misunderstood. But let me get back to my main point, right, which is about the institutions of the Constitution. The convention was not really interested in dealing with the slavery issues. They had to. They were interested in fixing the institutions of the nation, which meant they had to think about more than just Congress. They had to think about establishing an executive and a judicial branch as well. And when they finally turned their attention, when the framers turned their attention to the executive branch, new battle lines were drawn. Here, Americans had grown accustomed to having weak executives, but many saw the problems with having weak executives in the state. So they wanted to have a much stronger executive. How do you do that? How do you design an executive that's powerful, strong, can check the legislature, can defend the nation, and yet still be safe? The states didn't afford very good examples in this regard. They gave the president a 4-year term, far longer than most of the states allowed for their governors. This would provide for stability in the office. They allowed the president to run for a second term and theoretically a third term. There was no term limits. And a fairly powerful veto was granted to the president. A veto that didn't require the concurrence of judges, as some states did. It was not an absolute veto. Congress could overturn it, but it was really hard for Congress to do so. The harder issue actually ended up being the mode of selecting the president. Some thought a congressional appointment was best because they feared that a popular election of the president might lead to a demagogue. So they feared the popular election, but they realized that a popular mandate might be good. Others thought that Congress should choose the president, but people worried that that would turn the president into something like a clerk. James Wilson from Pennsylvania proposed a complicated system that would allow states to choose electors who would then in turn choose the president. No one liked that idea. They laughed at him. But a couple weeks later, they came around because they couldn't think of anything better. Complicated though the system was, and still is, it does have a few benefits. It combines the influence of the people with the interests of the states. It also usually yields a clear winner. And this is not something to brush off lightly. There have been very few contested elections in America. I mean, really contested elections. Usually the outcome is far clearer than it would be if we relied upon a popular national election, where it's more likely no one would receive a majority of the votes. Right now, someone almost always receives a majority of the electoral votes, and it's not close. Usually, it's a very decisive victory. Surprisingly, the institution that occupied the convention the least is the institution that I think is now most preoccupied with learning about the debates of the convention, and that's the judiciary. In relatively short order, the convention agreed to a Supreme Court. As for inferior courts, the delegates were content to let Congress figure that out. So most of our judicial system is actually made by law, laws that Congress passes, with some guidance from the Constitution. But what Congress can't do is change some important things about judges. Federal judges are appointed, they're not elected. They require presidential nomination and the Senate's approval. They serve for good behavior, which means for life or until they decide to resign, although they can be impeached. And they have the responsibility and therefore the authority to ensure that provisions of the Constitution are actually meaningful, which means they can occasionally, if they need to, deem acts of state legislatures and even the US Congress unconstitutional, making those laws moot. This Constitution, thus, when you look at all of the institutions, resolves all the difficulties of the Articles of Confederation. It establishes a national government while leaving room, even if not sovereign room, for state governments. It creates well-crafted institutions. Congress is built for deliberation. The executive is designed for energetic action. And the judiciary is arranged to render judgment. It provides the means of gathering appropriate resources for governing. And it's very well written. Again, I would commend Gouverneur Morris to your attention. It's divided into 7 articles, and it's very logical. I don't have the preamble up here, but there's a very elegant preamble. I should have put it up here just so you could compare it with the preamble of the Articles of Confederation. But if you get one of those Jack Miller pocket constitutions, you could look at it yourself. It's a very nice preamble. Article 1 deals with Congress. It actually takes up about half of the Constitution. It begins by talking about the Articles of, or the House of Representatives. In other words, the House closest to the people. It then discusses the Senate. Article 2 deals with the President. That makes sense because you need laws before you can start talking about the execution of those laws. Then the judiciary. Right? There's no need for a judiciary unless you're actually executing laws. And then it turns to some issues regarding the states. There's a few prohibitions put on the states. Article 5 deals with a process for amending the constitutions. They knew what they were doing was not perfect. It would need to be updated and changed from time to time. Article 6 deals with a few miscellaneous things. Most famously, it contains the Supremacy Clause. Just in case anyone doubted that the design of Congress made clear we're dealing with a nation rather than 13 nations, we have a clause in Article 6 that clarifies this, that what the US Congress does is superior to what the states do, as long as Congress is doing something it actually has power to do. And then the last one lays out the procedures for ratifying the Constitution, which is kind of interesting. Right? The document that they're ratifying lays out the rules for its own ratification, which is worth talking about. This is all really important because if it works, if people will adopt this, and if they do so peacefully, then a major political problem, a failing government, was fixed without a revolution, without having to have another Declaration of Independence, without having to have another war. And when Alexis de Tocqueville came to America in the 1830s and reflected upon the Constitutional Convention, he makes this point. He makes it stronger than I'm making it today. He says that the independence, the revolution that the Americans fought against the British was really not all that great. I disagree with Tocqueville on that. I think it is great. He didn't think it was all that great because revolutions happen all the time. Right? He's French. He's coming from France in the 1830s. But here's what America was able to do that the French weren't able to do. Right? What's new in this history of societies is to see a great people warned by its legislators that the wheels of government are stopping, turn its regard on itself without haste and without fear, sound the depth of the ill, contain itself for 2 entire years in order to discover the remedy at leisure, and when the remedy is pointed out, submit voluntarily to it without costing humanity 1 tear or drop of blood. The move from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution happened peacefully. Ironically, that's probably why we don't celebrate it. But it's why we should celebrate it. And before it was actually ratified, when the debates were still happening, Alexander Hamilton made this same point. He said, "It's been frequently remarked that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country by their conduct and example to decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice. Reflection and choice. Or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. Hamilton's saying what we're doing by moving from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution has never been done before. No one has ever peacefully made this kind of political transition. We're going to debate it. If it's no good, don't vote for it. But if we can persuade you that it actually is a decent constitution, not perfect, but decent, then you should adopt it. The Anti-Federalists were concerned, though. Right? They feared that what was being created was too big, it was novel, it was new. No one's ever tried constructing a republic on these terms at this size, of this size. It would break apart local communities. There was no provision for inculcating Republican virtue. And most famously, it doesn't contain a Bill of Rights. And so I think it would be an incomplete talk tonight if I didn't say something about the Bill of Rights. But I'll make it brief. At the convention, in its closing days, George Mason proposed a Bill of Rights, but no one was interested in it. Someone suggested that it would take too long. It was hot. They kept the windows shut. They're ready to go home. Mason said it wouldn't take long at all, that he could pump it out in a couple of hours. He was, after all, the author of the Virginia Bill of Rights. We could just copy that. Why not? No one bit. Most of the delegates seemed to think it was unnecessary. Why? It's important to remember that what Mason was proposing was a preamble to the Constitution. That's what people meant by Bill of Rights. It turned out that the Anti-Federalists were able to persuade many Americans that a Bill of Rights was necessary. They wanted a Bill of Rights, and deals were struck in several of the state ratifying conventions to propose amendments to better secure people's rights. It is important to remember that the people really did have in mind a preamble, something like the Declaration of Independence, something like the general aphorisms that begin the state bills of rights. Madison decided the only way he could get into this new national government was to run for the House of Representatives, which meant he needed the votes of regular Virginians who wanted a Bill of Rights. And so Madison jumped onto the Bill of Rights bandwagon after opposing it at the convention. What he actually did, though, he did tell his constituents he would work on amendments to the Constitution. And he did. He got to Congress, and one of the first things he did was propose amendments. He was careful not to really call it a Bill of Rights, but it kind of looked like a Bill of Rights. What he proposed was condensed into 12 articles. Madison made sure to say, I don't want these to come at the beginning. I want to give you 12 things that should be interspersed throughout the text. Right? He was worried that by putting something at the beginning, it would distract from what was going on in the text. The text itself, as Hamilton said, was meant to protect liberty. It was a Bill of Rights. It turns out that they put these things at the end because they were worried, Roger Sherman was worried, that by putting them throughout the text, the signers of the Constitution, it would look like they supported all of those provisions. And so they listed them at the end. But they were meant to go throughout the text, and you can kind of see that when you line them up. I say 12 because there were 12 that Congress approved and sent to the states for ratification. Only 10 of those were approved by the states initially. Here's a little tidbit you can always pull out at a party and impress your friends. The 27th Amendment was one of the original amendments that was proposed as part of the Bill of Rights. If you line them up and you look at the logic of them, what you'll see is that it's not really the Bill of Rights the people were asking for. What it really does, what these amendments do, is reinforce the institutional logic of the Constitution itself. So here are the first 3 amendments Number 3 is what you recognize as the First Amendment, because it was ratified, the other 2 were not. Right? The First Amendment deals with the size of the House of Representatives. It says nothing about individual rights. The second one, which is now the 27th Amendment, has to do with the salary of members of Congress, because Congress has to come up with its own salary by law. And so what Madison thought people might like to see is that if they decide to increase their salary, that increase doesn't take effect until after the next election. Congressional elections happen every 2 years. For whatever reason, not enough states approved those 2 amendments to have them ratified. They didn't ratify these 2, so they weren't included initially. That means that what we call the First Amendment was supposed to be the Third Amendment, which says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, prohibiting the free exercise thereof, abridging the freedom of speech or the press, or the right of the people to peacefully assemble. That does look like rights, right? That does look like a list of rights, but had this been put in the Constitution, it would have been added to the list of things Congress cannot do, which is Article 1, Section 9, if you're taking notes. You put them together, the first 3 have to do with the legislative branch. They have to do with Congress. They're just provisions that reinforce the institutional design of Congress. The next 3, 4, 5, and 6, or what we call 2, 3, and 4, deal with the executive branch. And they kind of look like rights too, but they're really directives or clarifications about things that are going on in the executive branch. Remember, prosecutions are an executive function. The next several deal with the judiciary. Sort of interesting. The Constitution itself has very little to say about the judiciary. The Bill of Rights has a lot to say about the judiciary. And I won't read them to you. You can read them in your pocket Constitution later. And then the last 2, and look at these ones individually, what's now the 9th Amendment deals with the issue of rights. What do we think of rights in a republic? The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. It means that there's no way we can list all of your rights. Right? The problem Hamilton and others thought with the Bill of Rights is that if you try and list your rights, that's okay if you're in a monarchy and you want to clarify what the monarch has to do or can't do. But in a republic, we treat the government the way the monarch treats the people. In other words, the people give the government its rights, not the other way around. So just remember, anything that looks like a right in the Constitution is just there by chance. It's not a full summary of the rights that you have as a person or as a citizen. And then the 10th Amendment, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people, which just reinforces what I just said. Right? In a republic, government has power because the people gave it power. And if we didn't give it power, it doesn't have that power. That's pretty much all the 10th Amendment says. All right. So here's the takeaway. That was a lot. I told you I was going to tell you a lot today. Kind of an overview of everything, which means I didn't go deep enough into anything, but hopefully it gave you a few things to think about. Why does September 17th matter? Well, you can have high-sounding rhetorical flourishes about liberty. You can enjoy reading the Declaration of Independence. You can enjoy reading the State Bills of Rights, and you're going to find that wonderful rhetoric there. You can list rights that you want to protect until the cows come home. But if you don't have well-designed institutions, then all that pretty rhetoric, all those lists of rights, don't really mean much. Getting the form of government right really does matter, and it's really hard to do. And the men who took part in the 1787 convention got the forms right, or about as right as they could have, given the pressures and the circumstances that they faced. They demonstrated to the world, just put these all up here, one more. They demonstrated to the world that reason and choice are indeed possible when crafting government, and that revolutions can be civilized and not bloody. With Tocqueville, we should admire the framers who took part in the convention. We should also admire the fruit of their labors, the Constitution. And we should remember the date that that Constitution was signed at the convention. Right, that date's September 17th. A date that matters and a date we should celebrate. Thank you.
So when I come around to you, make sure to talk into the microphone so that your words can be captured and heard by everybody.
What do you say to people who say the Constitution needs revision? I feel like I've been hearing that, and I would love to hear what you would have to say to someone who asked about that.
The Constitution probably does need revision. It just depends on what revision you're talking about. So it would be the particulars of the revisions that really matter. So do you have a revision in mind? Looks like you do.
Well, so there's the sort of abuse of Section 230 going on regarding the freedom of speech, and I'd like, and there's also stuff going on with the Second Amendment, right? Like the right to bear arms, and I don't like. I'm seeking advice on how to defend those to people who take those for granted and think we don't need them.
Sure. Yeah, I almost gave you my longer Bill of Rights speech because I have a lot to say about those things. So those particular things you mentioned are already in the Constitution. So the problem is that we don't think about them the way that I talked about them tonight. So what we were given by the framers and by the first Congress was a prohibition on Congress curtailing freedom of speech. And it was really about the power of legislation, power of the legislative body. And what we have now is something that's defended by the courts. So the way we think of the Bill of Rights now as a list of rights has had the effect of giving the judiciary a lot of power in determining what our rights are and how our rights work. I think originally those were supposed to be legislative questions, not judicial questions. Not that the judiciary couldn't have anything to do with it, but we've really put a lot on the judiciary's shoulders right now in order to think through these really difficult questions. Many of them are political questions. So I don't know if there's ways of revising the Constitution that would better protect those rights. Maybe. I think a lot of it's really an education question, first of all, and getting the political branches, Congress especially, but also the presidency, to stand up for themselves a little bit more. I think this is especially true of Congress. Congress has a lot of power, and they don't always do much with it. And they could push back on some of the things that come from the court if they wanted to. So amending the Constitution takes a lot of work. It's really hard to do. If it needs to be done, it should be done. But we also can do a lot without having to go to the extent of actually amending it.
Assuming the Constitution works properly, what do you say to people who disagree with that? Like that's kind of where my question
Okay, yeah.
is.
More general question. Well, depends on what you mean by work. What's the evidence that the Constitution works well? We're not going for perfect, right? You never go for perfect in politics. You're never going to get there, and you're going to be really disappointed. Right? The most unhappy people I know are people who want perfection out of politics. You're not going to have it. But what do we want? Well, the preamble to the Constitution, which I should have had up here, lists some things that we should want from government. One of them is security. Our Constitution does a pretty good job of securing us. Not perfect, but we don't have major political rebellions. When we do, they're easily put down. We don't have people attacking us. Right? We're very secure. right? Extremely secure. Does our economy work? Yeah, our economy works really, really well. Why does it work well? In part because we have a very sound political infrastructure to support it. Does it work perfectly? No. But again, perfection's not the answer. So are our rights protected? Do we enjoy liberty in America? Not perfectly, but really, really well. I drove in the last 24 hours through 4 states. I didn't have to stop at borders. Nobody's checking for passports. My money works. My Pennsylvania money works in Connecticut and Rhode Island. Right? These are all things that we take for granted. We fight about things that are really on the fringes, and that's not to say they're not important. But the things that really do work well, I'm glad we don't have to talk about those things. It means that things generally work. People complain about the judiciary. I complain about the judiciary a lot. I can't think of another nation I'd want to go to if I was ever accused of a crime where I would actually expect to get a fair trial. At the trial level, our courts work extremely, extremely well. Right? That's evidence of really sound institutions. If your liberty is abused, either by a fellow citizen or by the government, you can make a real case in courts. And maybe you'll lose, but you at least have the chance to have your say. And if that doesn't work, you could go to the public and have your say. The press has way more freedom here than it has anywhere else in the world. There's drawbacks to that, but we have it. They don't have that in England. Right? There's things the press cannot do in England. And England's a pretty free country. So we're secure, we have real liberty, our economy works. Right? These are kind of low but solid things that governments can do, and our government happens to do those things, I think, really well. And it does it well because the institutions are designed well. So maybe for your friends who don't think the Constitution's working, ask them how well they like their security, their liberty, and their money.
It was a great presentation. In the Articles of Confederation, would you say that the states were hesitant to help each other because it was most convenient for them, or because they're used to operating independently as colonies? Or?
That's a great question. So why didn't anyone go help Massachusetts when there was a rebellion going on? Because it costs money to send your militia to Massachusetts. It's not always politically popular to do it. Right? The Shays Rebellion was Shays Rebellion because there were a lot of regular people in Massachusetts who thought that the laws favored the wealthy rather than the poor. Right? That they wanted laws that would relieve debt because they were in serious debt because the economy was awful. It wasn't just awful in Massachusetts, it was awful in Pennsylvania and Virginia. Well, Virginia was a little bit better, but most of the colonies or states, they're states at this point, most of the states had suffering economies after the Revolution. And so there was a lot of sympathy from regular people for what was going on in Massachusetts. And so what state governor is going to risk their next election, which is because most states had one-year terms for governor, what governor or what legislature is going to risk their seat and power by actually doing what the Articles of Confederation tells them to do? There's no political incentive to do it. And because your economy is suffering, and you have a lot of things to do within your state, let's say you're Pennsylvania, you have a lot of roads and bridges to build in Pennsylvania, and Congress says, hey, we need money from you, Pennsylvania, and the Articles of Confederation says you'll give us money whenever you ask for money. Well, if you're a state legislator and you only have so much money to work with, and you want to build roads that will be very popular among your constituents, or you just want to send a check to the Congress of the United States, which one are you going to do? You're going to build those roads, right? That's your top priority. So it's not that they didn't want to help out Massachusetts. It's not, although they might not have wanted to. It's not that they didn't want to pay their annual dues. The institutions didn't put them in a position where they had to. So it was more an institutional matter than anything else. Great question. Yes, sir.
I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but John Adams said that the Constitution was created for a religious people and is wholly inadequate for any other. And if I were to put that in my own words, I would say what really makes this thing hang together is a shared moral and ethical framework that government exists to support but not to provide.
Right.
So I'm wondering if you have thought about that and have any anything you'd like to share.
Thought about it a lot. Thanks, great question. There's about 7 different ways I can approach this, if you think of one. George Washington, that's a good example. The number of times that Washington speaks of Providence is really striking to me. Washington's able to speak in a way that's going to appeal to a lot of Americans. He's not using the language of one church or one denomination. He's using language that's consistent with a lot of different denominations in the Judeo-Christian tradition. That's broad enough that it might even appeal to others. But it's sincere. And what he often says is that what we're doing in governing as a republic, or what any government really has to do, is figure out how to cooperate with the governance of the entire universe. That's what providence is. God provides for the entire universe. Government tries to provide for a particular people. Those two forms of providence need to come together, need to coalesce. So when you read Washington's farewell address, and he talks about this, it's one of the parts that I think we need to pay more attention to the entire farewell address. It used to be read very regularly. Nobody reads it anymore. But when he talks about that this government was built for a people who's moral. The government's job isn't to keep you moral. There needs to be other institutions that do that, societal institutions to do that, families, churches, schools, civic organizations, that morality is really important to be maintained. And he says, do not make the mistake of thinking that we can have morality without religion. You can't do it, right? As soon as religion goes, morality is going to be out the door too, right? The sort of morality we need to maintain a republic. So I would agree with Washington on that. And some of my friends are of the opinion that the reason we see so many problems in America today is because the Constitution wasn't built well enough. It was too liberal, they would say. In other words, the Constitution encourages immorality. And I'm not convinced that that's true. I think it's sort of the other way around. The Constitution depends on the people having certain virtues and habits, but it expects people to maintain those things themselves, because if the government's doing it for you, then it's not really a virtue. Right? And so we have to do our work better as citizens, as parents, as teachers, as clergy, whatever our role is in society. Not that we do it for the sake of politics, but the better we are at actually helping to build up the life of virtue, not only is it good for people to be virtuous, it's good for our republic to have virtuous citizens. So we need to work more on that. Thanks.
You mentioned during your talk that the 27th Amendment was originally proposed along with the original Bill of Rights. So my question to you is that if there was, say, an amendment that was proposed but never ratified that probably should have been, so like what was, like, in your mind, what is like the best amendment that never was?
Gosh, I don't know all the amendments that haven't been ratified. That's a great question. So that means I could just make one up, right?
Feel like it?
I don't know. I mean, I have thought about this, that there are ways in which our institutions could be tightened up a little bit. I mean, the Electoral College is one. Most of the institutional amendments are about the Electoral College. We've tinkered with it a bit, and we still can't quite get it right. But we're still in the same position as the framers. We can't think of anything better to do. And so we'll probably never get away from the Electoral College, but maybe we could do things that would be better. And I think a lot of the problems with the presidential selection system we have right now aren't so much the Electoral College, although it's far, far from perfect, but it's the extra constitutional things that have arisen alongside the Electoral College. I am not a fan of primary elections. I don't know if we could amend those out of our system, but I don't think they yield the best candidates for the office. But I don't know if we have the stomach to do anything else. I think we tend to think that democratically elected things are the best things. The way primary elections are relatively new. For a long time, parties just were very strong enough to choose their candidates. And there's problems with that too, of course, but I think we tended to have safer candidates. I don't know what the word is exactly that I'm looking for. At least more consistent candidates. In other words, the demagoguery that the framers feared by popular elections, we end up getting it anyway because of primary elections. So I don't know. I've wondered if there's a way of kind of providing a fix for that through an amendment. But I don't know what it would look like. I'd have to think a lot more about it.
Please give a warm applause to Dr. Foss. And don't forget to join us in the reception hall down the road.